Welcome to Golf and the Good Life, your guide to golf travel across the pond. I'm DJ Jones. He is Connor Evers. And today we are sharing some tips and advice for hitting Scotland and Ireland within the same golf trip. But before we get there, Connor, we have reached the point of the year where many of us at H&B kind of fan out across the UK and Ireland. If memory serves, roughly when this comes out, you're going to be somewhere in Scotland, if I recall correctly.
That's true. A little R&R once the 2024 golf travel season is complete. So spending a little less than a week or so in Scotland with my dad. We're going to spend 3 nights in Dornoch. I'm playing Brora as well as Royal Dornoch. So looking forward to that as always. And then spending a little bit more time in Edinburgh as well, just kind of hanging around. I haven't actually just been to the city and just kind of sat and explored it. So looking forward to doing some more touring and what have you. And then heading over to Denmark and Sweden, which will be my 29th and 30th countries. So looking forward to that as well on the tail end. So very excited for that. A little bit of golf, but it's mostly touring on this one. So looking forward to taking in Scotland from off the golf course too. But Deej, you're heading overseas as well as I hear.
Yeah, absolutely. My fiance and I are actually headed to, Scotland and Ireland. We're going to go do Edinburgh for several days and then hop over to the Belfast area and get up to Portrush as well. The golf clubs are staying at home, but we're checking in on several different accommodation partners that are either currently in the fold, if you will, with H&B, or might become part of the recommendations that we make for expeditions. And then there's several restaurants as well that our concierge Whitney Hedrick has said, "Hey, go have dinner at this place, will you?" So looking forward to that. There won't be any golf, although we are taking a day trip up to St. Andrews. My better half has never actually been there, so I thought it would be cool to show her around my favorite city in the world. And I couldn't be an hour from Janetta's and Tailend and not find a way to squeeze those two places in. So we're going to take a day trip up there, and who knows what else we'll do while we're there. But that actually kind of ties in perfectly to today's episode because we are talking about hitting Scotland and Ireland in the same trip. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today kind of goes against a lot of what we preach here on the podcast. And, if you spend any amount of time on the H&B website, you know that we're big on, hey, pick a region or two, play all the great golf in those areas. Don't overdo it. This isn't your first rodeo. You will be back for more trips. And by its very nature, doing these two countries at the same time, while, looking at them on the map and so forth, it's just right there. It's actually adds a lot of complexity and a lot of jumping around, and it's just not for everyone. And so it's not something that we recommend for every group, but yet at the same time, we get it. We've got a lot of groups that either it's just they're kind of pretty set on, hey, I want to hit these big time courses and I'm only going to be able to get to go, once every 3 years or so. So I don't have time to wait. Or B, what we're finding is as the millennial generation kind of more of them hit into their 40s, we are very accustomed to a much faster pace of travel. We don't mind jumping around. I say I think I'm in that elder millennial category, I think is what the actual definition is. But, we're used to saying, hey, I'll sleep when I get home. And so I think the demand for this type of trip is going to continue to rise. But Connor, there are a lot of things that you've got to keep in mind when putting this type of thing together. And why don't you share with us some of what drives your decision making, if you will, in the planning process for a duo trip?
Yeah, I'll kind of start off. I mean, I'm usually a half glass full person, but maybe the opposite when it comes to this. Not pessimistic, but just kind of give a little bit of the characteristics of doing both countries in one trip. But the big kind of first question that the group needs to kind of understand is how much time do you have? If you're trying to do both countries and you're trying to do it in a 5 or 6 night trip, it just doesn't make sense. If you're doing it that short, pick one region, and just go to it, or two and but in the same country. It just creates less of a headache. Now, I would say if you're trying to do both, from a minimum night perspective, it's usually 7 to 8 nights you're going to need. There's just a few trips that we will talk about in a little bit that will make sense for those 7 to 8 nights, but I would say that's about the minimum. And I would also say, is it right for your group? The biggest thing is you don't want to overdo it. You don't want to have a jam-packed itinerary where you come back and you're like, I only remember the golf. I don't remember, any of the pubs we were in or the touring we did, or maybe you weren't even able to do any of that stuff. You were just on the golf course the whole time. And that's not an expedition that we want, and frankly, what you want. So don't overdo it. That's our biggest advice. And I think, speaking to myself or one of our other expedition planning managers at H&B will guide you in the right direction. So that's not the case. And some other logistics you're going to have to look at. So say, one of the big trips, and Deej is going to talk about in a little bit, is the west coast of Scotland and then the Northern Ireland, Belfast area. It's a very popular one. I would say it's the most common, trip that you're doing both countries. You're going to have to get from one country to the other in the middle of your trip. So you're going to either taking a flight, you're either going to have to the ferry. So there's another logistical standpoint and touch point where things unfortunately could go wrong. Ferry could be delayed, your flight could be canceled, other different things that could just add to the logistical point where it could go awry. And luggage too, especially when you're flying over, it could get lost too. So you could have your clubs for the half end of the first half of the trip and then not without. It's just something to consider when doing that. And I will say too, you may have it laid out perfectly on paper, but until you're overseas, it can be a lot. Add in a few days off from the course to kind of take in the touring. Have that day off in the middle when you are, flying or faring over from one country to the other. It just helps get you back on point for the rest of the trip as well. A lot of times, our groups sometimes it'll come to us and want to do both. And again, we'll talk through the different logistics of doing both countries. And a lot of times the mindset is to do both, but again, when we kind of chat more about it, a lot of times it then dissolves into two separate trips. They realize, okay, I can't do this. I don't have 10, 11, 12 nights to do this right. And we ended up just doing that 6, 7, 8 night trip, but just one country. And the other thing too is when you do both, you're gonna miss out on some different things. It's just inevitable. So I was talking to Deej before we were on the podcast, and I have a group going over next year. They're doing a 7 night trip, 3 nights on the Ayrshire coast, 4 nights in Belfast. They do have a rival day golf, so they're playing Dundonald, the Elsa course at Turnberry, Prestwick, Royal Troon, Portstewart, Royal County Down, Royal Portrush. Now, a really solid itinerary, don't get me wrong, but you're not going to hear the likes of Ardglass on there. You're not going to hear the likes of Western Gales. It's just, you can't do it. There's other courses and some touring and things you're just going to miss out on with doing both. So just something to consider. And maybe it just leads into two separate trips and save it. So you can be able to add on Ardglass or Castle Rock up in the Northern Ireland. So just something to consider when doing both countries.
Well, that's a great point is in terms of the amount of time and that, hey, most of us only really can miss, say, a week of work, right? So in order to make it fit into that window of time, you're gonna have to shave somewhere. And more than likely you're probably shaving a course off that you really should be playing. And so, doing it as two separate trips ends up being the right way to go. And then I loved what you said about you're adding a layer of complexity when it comes to the jump. Whether you're flying or taking the ferry, it's a lot different than if you had come into Scotland and you're transferring by your coach. You're not, once you hand off your luggage and hand off your moving your person to another, entity like an airline or a ferry, you're just asking for something to go sideways. Perfect example. I once was on the west coast of Scotland and I was going to take the ferry across to Machrihanish, and the ferry got canceled that day, just like you were talking about. And I had to take the long and winding road, as they call it, all the way up and around Machrihanish. It was like hours and hours to my day. It was like 6 hours or something by the time I finally made it over there versus the hour long ferry. So, that stuff can happen. But like you said, the West Coast and Belfast is kind of the most common combo that we do when it comes to this type of trip. And the reason for that is very simple. The ferry between Cairn Ryan and Belfast is actually pretty great. I've done it myself. It's only about a 2.5 hour ferry ride, and it's really kind of like a little mini cruise ship that goes across the Irish Sea. I paid roughly 10 or 20 extra pounds. I can't remember what, but it wasn't very much to upgrade to like this private lounge where you had leather chairs and it was a closed off area and it was much quieter. They had a server that came around and served drinks and so forth if you wanted. And if you're taking the ferry, it is worth every single penny because once you stepped out of that room, it was a little busy out there. But nice ride, very easy. If you're taking a coach, the coach can go right on the ferry and go across. So you might be able to have the same driver depending on what's happening. Sometimes you can't, and so you do end up having two different drivers. That's a whole another thing that is on a transportation episode, I guess, maybe at some point. But it's just you're eliminating an airport, and that's a big plus for doing this combination. But the other thing is, look, you're talking Turnberry, Royal Troon, Royal Portrush, and Royal County Down. For just home run courses that you can knock out in one trip. And if that's all you play, you've done really great. Granted, we're just talking about how you left some courses on the table, but listen, if it's just those four, that's pretty awesome. And then essentially you are coming home via Dublin, where you've got so many flight options direct from the US, far more than coming home from Edinburgh. So you do actually ease up your logistics. And then if you do this route by, okay, you stay somewhere on the west coast of Scotland and then you jump over to Belfast, you've got a couple options. You could stay, you could split the stay and do somewhere up near Portrush and somewhere near Royal County Down. But if you base yourself in Belfast, yes, you're adding some transfer time to the courses, but you are skipping an extra hotel jump. You're doing it essentially with still just two hotel stays, which is also a plus. But Connor, there are some other combos. Even though this is the most common one we do, there are some other ones that are good for this type of itinerary.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on select days, there's some flights from between like Edinburgh and Cork. So you could do the East Lothian area for golf and do some touring around Edinburgh area, which would be great. And then head over to Ireland. And then, like I said, flying to Cork, you could play Old Head. And then some of the other courses down kind of more in the Killarney area, so like Waterville, Tralee, Ballybunion. Now, with doing that, again, it goes back to the point of not being able to do everything. So you're going to probably, again, even just for about a 2 week long trip, you're going to miss out on some of those more courses up to the north. So with Dare Manor, Doonbeg, Lahinch, it's just kind of one of those things where you're limiting hotel jumps to be able to do both. But that would be a good option as well. Some good touring in both areas, as I mentioned. But it goes back to, again, you're going to miss out if you do both on a few other things. I mean, even if you go to Edinburgh, you're probably not going to be able to make it up to St. Andrews or to some other areas in Scotland. So it's just one of those things where, again, you could do both, but a lot of times when we explain this and go through all the logistics, it really comes down to, hey, this is just two separate trips. Let's do it right. Let's shave off, even less than 2 weeks, but get to multiple different areas and in just one country, and it frees you up from that standpoint. So again, Edinburgh and then the southern part of Southwest Ireland could be a good fit as well from that standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, obviously if you're over there on the Southwest coast, you could hop a flight home from Shannon. So you're saving yourself cutting back all the way over to say Dublin, which even though a lot of folks do end up going home from Dublin if they're playing Southwest Ireland. You've got Shannon right there, which eases up the logistics. But it's just a great point that doing this duo, unless you've got the full 2 weeks at your disposal, or even say 10 full days in country at your disposal, in a way, you're giving yourself just a taste of each spot. To be able to say you've done it, you've been there, done that kind of thing, you're going to be cutting off some pieces in order to make it fit into a week. Going back to, is it the right thing? It really just depends on how much time you've got and what kind of priority it is. If you're okay just saying, okay, I've been to both areas and I've hit two or three, but you're comfortable missing maybe a key course, then then it works out. Another combo that is also pretty common, that is, of course, the Edinburgh Dublin combo. You're essentially hitting the capitals of both countries. You've got some awesome touring. Those two cities, of course, are probably well, they are the biggest destinations in each country, both from a tourist and in a way from the golf standpoint as well. And like Connor was just saying, you're hitting, in Edinburgh, you've got the East Lothian courses, which we just did two whole episodes on the podcast about. Muirfield and North Berwick and Gullen and Dunbar are out there at your disposal. And then you jump over to Dublin, where you've got Portmarnock and the island. And basically, right in the heart of town is Royal Dublin, which definitely shouldn't be missed. County Louth is a little north of town. You've got the European Club. So there's a lot of Great Links golf, but again, squeezing that into a week or 8 or 9 days even is going to be tough because you've got a lot of touring in those areas. It would be just a complete travesty to go to Edinburgh and Dublin and only be playing golf. I mean, you've got to take a day or two, to see the cities. But that said, if you've got that time at your disposal, this is a great one for, say, couples where, if one half goes off and plays golf and the other half does some touring, there's plenty of options, for both. Whereas that West Coast and Belfast combo, it works still for couples, but beyond a couple of days on the West Coast, there's not a whole lot from a touring standpoint to fill a tourist itinerary. And then again, you're talking easy flights. I've done this jump numerous times. Edinburgh to Dublin, Aer Lingus has 3, 4, 5 flights a day in the peak of season. I feel like the same plane just kind of jumps back and forth all day long. And then, of course, again, you've got the easy access home from Dublin. But Connor, I know that the key that we're talking about today is doing both countries at once, but you and I were talking before the podcast about one that sort of counts, but it doesn't necessarily fit the description, but it belongs on this one.
Yeah, so next up would be doing Southwest Ireland and Northern Ireland. Again, if you will, different countries but same land. You can drive in between both, and we get this request a lot, and it's difficult, I'll say. And there's multitude of different facets. I mean, one big one is honestly just weekend play in between both courses. I mean, honestly, it's just general in Ireland. Sometimes there's no visitor play, or it's very sparse in the afternoon. And traveling in between both on the weekends is usually best. So, being in Southwest Ireland, playing golf throughout the midweek, and then the weekend traveling up to Northern Ireland and then playing up there. It'll work. But again, I'm talking 2 weeks. So it's a 2 week long trip if you want to do both properly. As DJ mentioned, we were talking about it. I mean, it's funny in Scotland, you could do in Dornoch for 3 or 4 nights and then go to Edinburgh or the Ayrshire coast. And yeah, it's a 4 hour drive, and it's long between both. But from Killarney to Belfast, it's a 5.5 hour drive. That's Google Maps, so it's probably more like 6.5. If stopping for petrol, and you're gonna have to stop for food too. I mean, it's literally a day trip. You're circumnavigating the whole country, if you will. So, you're gonna have to probably have a day off in the middle of the trip, especially if you have a coach with coaching hours, to just not play golf in the middle of it. So just something to consider. Again, we do it just for select groups. It's if you have ample time, again, 12 to 14 nights, in my opinion, is probably best to do this and do it right. If you want to do both in a 7 week long or 7 night trip, it's just not an itinerary that we would, put our name to and do. It's just too much running around. And again, it's going to feel like work rather than vacation. We don't want that for you, nor do you. So that's just kind of my opinion on that. So again, in the same landmass, two different countries, Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, but it's one of those to consider if you're doing both. And again, a lot of times it's just like, okay, this is two different trips. You're biting off too much than you can chew. That's really what it comes down to.
100%. And what you just said about, needing 2 weeks at your disposal. I mean, I think that for a lot of these combinations, the more time you have, the better. But listen, if you've got the time and you've got the flexibility, Connor, did several trips this year that were hitting a lot of the marquee names overseas. More, it was an itinerary that, quite frankly, made me a little nervous because it's like, how are you going to pull all this off? But he did multiple times, and so did Chris, and so did Mike, and we are able to do that. But we're only able to do that when there's both the flexibility and the time available to do it. If you're trying to make the trip work between, say, August 21st and August 30th, well, that goes out the window because we've got to have the essentially the wiggle room to make it all come together. But if you come to us and say, hey, I've got 2 weeks, when can I fit these courses? We can more than likely make it happen. But it goes back to, again, why it helps to have a pro in your back pocket that can help you navigate all this stuff, because it is a lot to manage, especially if you're trying to hit both places. But Connor, we think we covered this one in pretty good detail. Any final thoughts or anything before we wrap her up?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my final thought too, and you just mentioned it there, is flexibility. If you want to do both and want to knock off a lot of these courses, um, thinking the reality is all of the courses are going to line up with your itinerary. A lot of times it does happen. I will be honest, but there are some times where the course doesn't work this day; it needs to move to that day, and there's just some moving parts. And that's again why, as DJ mentioned, you hire an expert such as us to take care of this, especially doing both countries and especially doing the John of Muirfield, the old course. The list goes on, as you mentioned there. So yeah, that's what I would kind of mention there, is just be extremely flexible, and know that, hey, things might change a little bit, and that's just par for the course.
Well, that's all outstanding stuff. And as usual, we will have some additional guides in the show notes. We actually have a blog on our website that covers this very topic, maybe in a little further details. If you have any questions, DM us on social media or shoot us an email, goff@haversham.com. Otherwise, thanks as always for tuning in. We will be back again soon with another episode. But until then, we wish you plenty of golf at its finest and life at its best.